Good morning, everyone. I'm Virginia Langerberg, SBS News presenter and your host for today. For those of you that would like to use closed captions today, you can use your mouse to click on the closed captions logo on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Welcome to the 2021 Census Cultural Diversity Data Seminar by SBS and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, coming to you live from SBS's Studio One in Sydney on Cammeray Gold Country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country that we are joining you from today in Artarmon, and I extend this acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of country wherever you may be. We pay respect to elders past and present for their continued stewardship and care for country, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues joining us for this event. Today's seminar will provide useful and practical information for any organisation wishing to learn more about the makeup of an increasingly culturally diverse Australia. We'll also take audience questions submitted via Slido, the online question tool at www.slido.com, using the event code Census Seminar, and answer them at the end. In Slido, you can use the voting button to select the questions you'd most like to hear answered. But first, I'd like to introduce today's guests. Duncan Young, General Manager, Census for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Mohammed Al-Kafaji, CEO of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, and Mandy Wicks, Director of News and Current Affairs for SBS, responsible, among other things, for SBS World News, which comes to you live each night from this desk, as well as SBS's multilingual Census Explorer tool, which I'm sure we'll talk about later this morning. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of today's seminar is to engage with our experts and with you, our audience, on insights from the 2021 Australian Census relating to Australia's culturally and linguistically diverse communities. As Australia's biggest survey, we know that the census is an invaluable evidence base for which governments, public agencies and both community and commercial organisations can draw to plan their products and services for the Australian community, whether they are core services in areas such as health, education or employment, community support and engagement services, including those that help promote a sense of belonging and foster social cohesion, or public or commercial services provided in English and the wide range of other languages spoken in Australia. It is the census that provides the most accurate snapshot of the composition of contemporary Australia, providing information about the makeup of our communities across the country. Today's seminar will include a presentation from Duncan, our census expert, who will speak to us about the ABS's newest deep dive analysis of cultural and linguistic diversity data released today. A panel discussion with Duncan, Mohammed and Mandy, where we will have the opportunity to hear from Mohammed about how bodies representing people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds use the census data to shape their services, and Mandy on how SBS is making the data available to communities and using it to shape its services, and importantly, a chance for our experts to answer your questions, which you can enter at any time via Slido. But before we hear from Duncan, we'll first hear from the Honourable Dr Andrew Leigh MP, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, and the Assistant Minister responsible for the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
G'day, my name's Andrew Leigh, the Assistant Minister responsible for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And it's a real pleasure to have the chance to speak to you today about cultural diversity and the Australian Census. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land today, so let me acknowledge the traditional owners: Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Dara Wari, Dindi, Wangaralin. And as I do so, I want to acknowledge any Indigenous people present at your conversation today and commit myself, as part of the Albanese Labor government, to the Uluru Statement of the Heart and its implementation in full. The Australian Census is a remarkable tool for understanding Australia's cultural diversity. Since 1911, it's asked about the country of birth. Back then, 82% of Australians said they were born in Australia. Curiously, 4,289 people in the 1911 census said they were born at sea, a number that you'd imagine has slightly fallen in the ensuing 111 years. But the census is today an extraordinary tool for better understanding Australia's cultural diversity. In 1971, the census added a question asking about where people's parents were born. And in 1986, it included for the first time a question about ancestry. And now we have this tapestry of questions. Which country were you born in? Which country were your parents born in? And what is your ancestry? That gives us a really rich picture about the multicultural diversity that is Australia. Australia is hardly a country that's free of racism, but we are a multicultural success story. Now in the census, we've seen more than a quarter of Australians, 27.9%, are born overseas. That includes my wife. We've also seen an Australia in which now, for the first time, more than half the population, 51.5%, say that they have a parent who was born overseas. And that includes our 3 children. We've also seen in the latest census a huge increase in the Nepali-born population, a doubling since the 2016 census. It's a reminder of the wealth of experiences and ideas that ethnic diversity brings to Australia. We know that diverse firms tend to be more productive. Diverse cities are faster growing. Diverse countries are not only more interesting, but more efficient. And so what you do is fundamental to the ongoing prosperity of Australia. Tools in the census can help local communities better refine what they do. Just to take one example, the Casey Cardinia Library noticed in the 2016 census that they had a growing share of Punjabi speakers. They reached out to that community and had a conversation with them about the services that that community needed from their local library. And that led to them bringing in new Punjabi resources and ensuring they could better serve their community. I'm sure your conversations today will highlight a myriad of ways in which the census can better help us to understand Australia at a national level and Australia at a local level. I wish you all the best for productive conversations and for what you're doing to build a stronger, fairer, more egalitarian and more multicultural Australia. It is a critical part of what we do, and the census provides a unique window into understanding the nation. Thanks very much.
And our thanks to Minister Lee for his message, which showed both how the census has evolved over time to measure more of Australia's diversity and some excellent examples of the data in action. In 2021, when we were asked to complete our census forms, the Australian Bureau of Statistics told us that every stat tells a story. The ABS has now crunched all the numbers, and we'll now hear from Duncan, who will share some of the stories that are in the stats from the 2021 census. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Virginia. So I've been wondering, what is the most important date in Australia's history? Thought maybe 1st of January 1901, Federation. Maybe the 27th of May 1967, the referendum to recognise Australia's first people. Or the 15th of April 1915 and the landing at Gallipoli. How about the 16th of February 2002, that unforgettable moment when all of the competition fell over and Stephen Bradbury claimed Australia's first Winter Olympic gold? OK, maybe not that one, not the most important. But how about 30th of June 1947? It's a date that probably doesn't ring a bell for you. It was the date of Australia's 4th national census. I don't even think a census nerd like me could make the case that this is the most important date in Australia's history. But it is the starting point of a journey that I want to take you on through Australia's changing cultural diversity. Back in 1947, the Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier. 1 million Australians had served in that war, nearly 1 in every 7 of the Australian population. and sadly, nearly 40,000 Australians had not come home. The census showed that following the world wars, economic depression and restrictive immigration policies, the proportion of Australia's overseas population had dropped to under 10%, down from closer to 25% at Federation and only just a third of what it is now. I clearly can't recall the 1947 census. However, the 2021 census counted over 1 million people still alive who were in Australia at the time. What amazing change these Australians have seen in the 7.5 decades since. Australia's immigration policy started changing at this time, where the slogan of "Populate or Perish" was used under the leadership of Prime Minister Ben Chifley. The assisted passage migration scheme commenced, with immigration to Australia available for the price of the processing fees, a low £10. Admittedly, this was £10 more than my Irish ancestors paid. In 1818, he got a loaf of bread and a free trip to Australia. This scheme, though, remained in place until 1982. While this scheme was focused on the British Isles, similar schemes opened way for migrants to Australia from continental Europe and New Zealand. Sir Robert Menzies' final speech before his election in 1949, soon after, decreed, "Australians urgently need more people, and we shall vigorously continue a drive for them." He said, "Once received into a community, a new citizen is entitled to be treated in every way as a fellow Australian." He did, however, reinforce a commitment to the White Australia policy, but remained in place until 1973. From this point, Australia has seen its cultural diversity grow and grow, with the overseas-born population bouncing back to 20% by 1971 and nearly 28% last year. The 2021 census counted 235,000 surviving Australians that arrived in the 10 years from 1948 to 1957, hailing from over 140 different countries. However, almost 2 out of every 3 of these arrivals came from the big 4 of England, Italy, Germany or the Netherlands. Nearly 1/4 came from England alone. This is quite a different picture to what we see with the migration pattern over the last 10 years, where Australia welcomed 2.3 million new arrivals from over 200 countries who now call Australia home. The top 4 countries now only account for 2 out of every 5 arrivals, reflecting a much more diverse group of arrivals. And the top 4 have changed significantly, and they were in size order: India, China, England and New Zealand. Including those from India and China, 3 out of every 5 of the arrivals in the last 10 years are from our northern neighbours, Asia. Looking at recent arrivals and the country of birth of those that have arrived in Australia shows only a narrow slice of Australia's cultural diversity. For example, the post-Second World War period saw Australia welcome around 250,000 Italian migrants. Over the next 15 years, and a little over 300,000 Italian migrants overall. The population of Italians born in Australia then started to decline from 1971. Yet there is a growth in the number of people that have indicated in the census that they have Italian ancestry. The 2021 census showed that 1.1 million Australians have Italian ancestry. To put this size of this Australian-Italian community in context, only 2 cities in Italy have more than 1 million people, Rome and Milan. Of the 1.1 million Australians that have Italian ancestry, 460,000, nearly half, have both their parents born in Australia, showing a connection to Italian ancestry present in 3rd-generation Australians. I'm sure this includes some of you tuning in today. While these 3rd-generation Italian Australians are more commonly in Victoria, with 3 out of every 10 living in the Garden State, they've spread out more than their forebears, with 4 out of every 10 Italian-born living in Victoria. The census also shows that the 3rd-generation Italian Australians are a young cohort, with 2 out of every 3 under the age of 30 years. The census also shows that they're studying more, twice as likely to stay in school beyond Year 9 than those that were born in Italy and migrated to Australia, and 4 times as likely to get a bachelor degree. Only 14,500, or 1 in 30, of the 3rd-generation Italian Australians speak Italian in the home. While the Italians were the 2nd largest group of migrants in the 10 years from 1947, the 2nd largest overseas country of birth in Australia now is India, and it's still growing quickly, with an increase of nearly 50% since 2016. Think of that. For every 2 Indian born that were in Australia in 2016, they've welcomed one new country made into Australia over the last 5 years. The 2021 census counted 670,000 Australians that were born in India, who are referred to as first-generation Indian Australians. This group, like Italian Australians, are most likely to call Melbourne home. Nearly 40% of all first-generation Indian Australians are living in Victoria, and just over 30% in New South Wales. Notably, our Indian compatriots have some significant differences to the Italian Australians, with the first-generation Indian Australians reporting 159 different ancestries. While the majority reported Indian, there was also a large group that reported Punjabi and Sikh. Similarly, there is a diversity of languages spoken at home, with 1 in 4 speaking Punjabi and 1 in 5 speaking Hindi. This is a young working-age community with 3 out of every 4 aged between 20 and 49 years. It's often thought that the longer you're in Australia, the more likely you are to speak English well. However, the 2021 census showed that 96% of Indian-born spoke English well or very well, or only spoke English, a higher proportion than the 85% of Italian-born. Unlike the Italian Australians that are seen in greater numbers now in the 2nd and 3rd generation, Indian Australians only had significant growth in more recent times, and we're yet to see the growth of the 2nd and 3rd generations. In addition to the 670,000 first-generation Indian Australians, we've counted 240,000 second-generation Indian Australians. That is, people who are born in Australia but with at least one Indian parent. 3/4 of this group have both parents born in India. 3/4 of this group are under the age of 15 years. As this group gets older, we'll see the 3rd-generation Indian group grow, but at this stage there are only 14,000 third-generation Australians that report an Indian-related ancestry. In total, considering the 1st, 2nd and 3rd generation Indian Australians, the group is slightly smaller than the group of Italian Australians, however is growing more quickly. The group of Indian Australians, though, is not growing as quickly as the 3rd and final group in our census journey today. As Minister Lee said, the Nepali population more than doubled between the 2016 and 2021 census. At the turn of a century, there were less than 2,500 Nepali in Australia. That, interestingly, makes it more than twice as likely that you'll meet someone that has celebrated their 100th birthday than you'll find a Nepali who's been in Australia for over 20 years. It was in 2006 that the Great Nepali Migration to Australia began, with 20,000 new arrivals in the next 5 years, increasing the size of the population tenfold. The following 5 years saw Australia welcome 20,000 more. However, it was after 2016 that the growth really accelerated, going from 20,000 over 5 years to over 20,000 in 2018 alone, and similar numbers in 2017 and 2019. The first-generation Nepali Australian community has grown from 2,500 to 125,000 in only 2 decades. Unlike the Italian and Indian communities, the Nepali community have adopted New South Wales as their home, with more than half of the Nepalese-born settling there, compared to only 1 in 6 in Victoria. While the majority of Nepali are in these 2 states, their growth has been particularly notable in some of our smaller capitals, with Nepali now the 3rd most commonly spoken language at home, after English and Mandarin, in both Hobart and Canberra. Nearly all Nepali-born report having Nepalese ancestry and speaking Nepali, over 95% in both cases. Interestingly, the Nepali-born are even more likely than Indian-born Australians to be proficient in English, with 97% indicating speaking English or very well. This is a young, working-age population, with 85% between 20 and 39 years. Reflecting the recent immigration to Australia and the age of this group, the 2021 census only identifies a further 20,000 Nepali Australians amongst 2nd-generation Australians, with 90% of these having both parents from Nepal. We are actually yet to count any 3rd-generation Nepali Australians at all. However, this will surely be a feature of future censuses. Australia has seen cultural diversity grow over the last 75 years, with each generation of people that call Australia home, embedding a new dimension to our cultural landscape. Across the subsequent generations, I've spoken today about the Italian Australian community and the group of 3rd-generation Australians who are proud of their Italian ancestry, I've spoken about the Indian Australian community, a large first and second generation part of the Australian community. And I've spoken about the Nepali Australians, who are primarily first generation Australians and just starting to write their chapter into Australia's diversity story. The census counts people from over 200 countries of birth who speak over 150 languages and connect with over 300 ancestries. Australia is not only home to the world's oldest continuing culture, but also arguably home to the most diverse collection of cultures. There are so many different stories about Australia's diversity that are told through the census. And I look forward to discussing these more with you in the panel.
Thank you so much for that, Duncan. Now, we will have a question and answer panel now with Duncan joining us here. You can get involved for any questions you'd like to throw at our panel here. Jump on slido.com with the hashtag censusseminar. Now, we might begin with you, Mohammed. We've got some questions here. FECCA's role is to advocate on issues that affect culturally diverse communities to government, business and our broader society to promote the ongoing success of multicultural Australia. How do you and your members use the census data, and what has stood out most from the 2021 census?
Sure. We often celebrate Australia as one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world. And I think the recent census has showed that we are becoming more multicultural, not less. We have more than half of Australians were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. We have more than 20% of the population speaking languages other than English at home. That's an increase of almost 800,000 people from the 2016 census. And I guess our role as the National Peak Multicultural Organisation for the past 43 years has been to advocate on behalf of our members to government and to the wider business community to make sure that the policy design and the program design is more accessible to people who, for example, don't speak English very well or who can't navigate the complex systems here in Australia, for example. So how do we use the census data? Well, I mean, for example, I'll give you a very clear example. During COVID, the government was scrambling to try and communicate to multicultural communities or hard-to-reach communities. We didn't have the data to back up where those communities were, and so we had to rely on data linkage and the 2016 census data. So it was fairly old data, but for a long time during that period, we didn't actually know where we're going, and we had to try our best to try and communicate with everyone without having that data. But eventually, the government, and in partnership with the Department of Health and the people at the census, we were able to actually pinpoint which communities were actually falling behind in terms of vaccination rates, and so we could direct our efforts to make sure those communities are informed and also have the information that they need to, and empower them to actually build the community leadership to encourage the members to get vaccinated.
Yeah, and obviously we saw from Duncan's data that a lot can happen from 2016 to now in terms of the communities. Now, based on the data, are there key things that you think governments, public agencies, Australian corporates can do differently to better serve sort of the Australian public?
I think everyone has a role to play now, given that we are becoming more multicultural. I think it's really important for leaders in, whether it's in government, business, community, to commit to really understanding the cultural diversity of the customers, their population, their stakeholders. And that doesn't happen by just, talking about it. We need a strategy and a plan. We need a multicultural access and equity strategy and a plan, because otherwise people say nice things, but nothing really happens. We really need to understand who we're dealing with, because once you delve deep into it, not just with the census, I think organisations need to start thinking about how they collect that data to better understand who they're working with, because it's all about a sense of belonging. Once people feel like, the organisation cares about me and wants to know more, I think that's when we start to tap into the hidden benefits of diversity. We all talk about it, but really to tangibly understand what that feels like, I think that's where we need to go. Obviously, there are some government agencies and departments that do that really well, and there are some that need to play catch up. But the good thing is that the government has recognised that it needs to do more, and it needs to have a whole of government approach to this. In the lead up to the election, the government did commit to making sure that we have a national conversation about these issues, and we look forward to being part of that conversation.
Great. And Mandy, as I mentioned earlier, you're obviously head of SBS World News here, and your team's been responsible for the updated SBS Census Explorer. Can you tell us a little bit more about Census Explorer and how communities and organisations use it?
Definitely. So the Census Explorer we launched first in 2011 after the 2011 census, and then we updated it in 2016. And then this time around, we've actually rebuilt the tool, and for the first time we're actually providing it in languages other than English. So there's 9 languages including English, but also simplified traditional Chinese, Arabic, Vietnamese, Korean, Spanish, Italian, Greek and so on. So you can actually go in and play around in your language. It is an amazing tool. So all the things that Duncan and Mo have been speaking about, you can go in and have a play yourself and explore your suburb. You can explore by languages spoken, ancestry, religious beliefs, age, whatever turns you on, you can go and have a play in your suburb, or you can compare suburbs, LGAs, electorates. It's rich data and it produces maps and things that you can look at or you can share via social media. So it's accessible for everyone, and we do know that government departments use it, but also educational institutions. It's a great tool for students, but also community, settlement services, business, etc. It's available there for free, and the ABS has supported us in terms of plugging the data into the Census Explorer. And also for the first time, we have a First Nations area in the Census Explorer where, again, you can go in and you can look at the amazing richness of languages spoken, for example, right across Australia and search to your heart's content.
Incredible. Now, you're our stats man, Duncan. Tell us, when should we be using the ABS website, and when should we be using the SBS Census Explorer?
Well, let me first say we love the SBS Census Explorer at the ABS. It's a real cracker. Some of the most fun you can have online. I was in there last night. Comparing 2 different suburbs that I used to live in, and then I saw that there was a group of Sikh population in one of the suburbs. So I clicked on Sikh, and it brought up a whole lot of information about Sikh, and you can easily immerse yourself there for a long period of time. And I love what the SBS have done with census data there. The ABS website complements that. If you go to the ABS website, you can look at the complete profile of areas with products like Quick Stats, which give you just a nice web page for any particular area or geography in the country, and comparisons with the state and the country. But also you can go into our community profiles where you can download spreadsheets of data and really get into using that data to your heart's content. And then we also have a product called Table Builder, which will have census data in it from tomorrow, which allows you to build any table you want using the census data, and one which our users I know are really looking forward to.
Yeah, fab. And I have noticed there is a question in Slido about Table Builder. We'll get to that. But firstly, Mohammed, over the last few years, there has been a number of global situations, including obviously the pandemic. What are the main reasons people have migrated to Australia recently? And how do you think this is going to change?
Mm-hmm. Look, in the past decade, there's been an over-reliance on temporary migration to Australia, and I believe that was a short-sighted approach, because now we're seeing the challenges that we're facing in terms of attracting really skilled migrants to Australia, because we're competing with countries like Canada, US, and the UK, whose, migration processes are a lot easier and a lot smoother. So now we're kind of paying the price, because also remember during COVID we told temporary migrants to go back home because we couldn't look after them. So we have a reputational damage that we need to rebuild, and I think as Australia, as a welcoming nation, I'd like to think that Australia is a welcoming nation. We need to do more to rebuild that reputation, but also make sure that we have a focus on permanent migration, which is something that government has committed to at the Jobs and Skills Summit recently. So I think that's a really positive move. I think, knowing that we need more people going into the future, we're struggling in many different industries like the care workforce, whether it's aged care, childcare, and so on and so forth. We really need to be a destination, an attractive destination for skilled migrants, but also we need to make sure that we don't forget our obligation to refugees around the world, whether it's a humanitarian program or whether it's family reunion and partner reunion programs. All of that needs to increase as a percentage, rather than one taking over the other.
I was going to mention that because obviously the Jobs and Skills Summit, 2 days of a lot of people talking. Do you think that will change the patterns of migration? Yeah,
I think it will, because I think it was wonderful that business, unions and government came together and everybody agreed that we need to actually have focus on permanent migration, because we want to attract those people and we want to keep them and we want them to call Australia home eventually. So we need to really relook at the migration program as a whole, which the government has committed to, but also how do we actually support these people when they come to Australia. So it's not just an economic kind of argument, but also what are we going to do from a social policy and program perspective to support these migrants coming to Australia, and also having a pleasant and welcoming experience. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Mandy, SBS uses census data, obviously, to help determine how to provide its services. Some of our audience members may be aware of the regular SBS Language Services Review. How does SBS use the data in that process, and are there ways it's used to shape information, education and entertainment services here at SBS?
Yeah, absolutely. So the census, as we know, is our primary population tool. So when it comes to reviewing the services that we should be providing, that is our go-to. We look at a number of factors. So we look at the size of a language spoken at home, and so everybody would know that you would have answered the question, which language do you speak at home? So we take on board big languages, large languages, but then we look at high needs languages, and that's a combination of data, everything from recentness of arrival, English proficiency, household income, all those things that would inform somebody's need for a service in their language. So in 2016, for example, we added languages like Mongolian, Hakachin, Tibetan, Kirundi, Hmong, languages back in sort of our region. In 2011, interestingly enough, it was languages, a number of African languages that we added to our services. The interesting thing about this census data is that of the languages we currently service, about 75% have grown. So as Mo mentioned, there's been a big increase. So 5.6 million people now saying they speak a language other than English at home, an increase of 800,000, and that includes 2 years of a pandemic. So it's quite extraordinary. And languages like Punjabi growing by 80%. So we've got this, wonderful problem of all our languages having grown by kind of on average about 30%. So we're going through a process at the moment to look at which languages we should continue to service, which languages that we should be adding based on migration patterns. And the plan then is to announce that in the new year and make those changes in 2023.
Great. And we've obviously got the Arabic and Mandarin TV channels here as well. I mean, the way the Nepalese community is going, we might have a
That's it, Punjabi. I mean, we would love to. We're very passionate about sort of having languages really integrated into everything we do. SBS On Demand, you can log in your language in a number of languages. So we use that data to inform so much of what we do in order to make sure that we can provide the best services to communities here in Australia.
Great. Duncan, in your presentation, the Minister referred to a question that has been added to the census over time, from country of birth to questions about parents and ancestry. How do you expect the census questions to evolve ahead of the next census in 2026, and how can communities help shape that survey?
Yeah, that's a million-dollar question, literally probably a million-dollar question. We jest at the ABS that it's some of the most expensive real estate in Australia is that space on the census form. And every census we reach out to the public through a consultation process and allow public and community groups to make submissions into that process of what topics they think are most important for us to capture in the census, what things need to change, what things might not be as important anymore. And we have, at last census, nearly 500 different submissions in of different ideas and topics for a census. And so we work through those in a bit of a process to try and work out, well, what could be collected well in a census? Where is there a gap in information? How is that data going to be used? Will it really add value to the community? We do some testing, and then ultimately we make recommendations to government, and the topics of a census are decided by Parliament. So I can't give any sort of sneak previews at this stage. Certainly from my perspective, as a census lover, census tragic, I'd love a few more questions on the census, but it's something that we'll be working through. So that process of public submissions will start in early 2023, and so to certainly keep your eye out for the ABS website and in order to get involved with that process.
Okay, so it's not as simple as jumping on Slido and just putting them in.
No, not quite.
What are your thoughts on all of this, Mohammed? What are your thoughts in terms of future questions?
Look, I think something that's really interesting that we're starting to have a conversation now, especially with this new government, is the government's focus on tackling anti-racism. So that I think racism is an issue, and the Minister has mentioned that. We need the data to actually understand where it's happening and how it's happening and to which groups it's happening. So I think we need to have a national conversation around how we can actually use this data to try and, make Australia a more welcoming and more, give people a little bit more sense of belonging, but also some tools to be able to tackle some of these really hard, toxic social issues in our communities.
And Mandy, where would you go with the future
Well,
questions?
Duncan knows well that for the last sort of 10 years or so, I've been sort of talking to the ABS about whether we could add some kind of supplementary question to the languages question, because which language do you speak at home, we know doesn't necessarily capture the breadth and depth of languages spoken in Australia. If you're a Greek speaker and you're married to an English speaker, you'll probably speak English at home. And we know many people speak sometimes upwards of 4, 5, 6 languages, and it's such a valuable tool, economically and everything else, to understand the depth and breadth of language spoken here in Australia. So we keep sort of banging on about that, but I totally appreciate the complexity and the cost involved in adding languages each time.
Fascinating. Even lost languages, I was born overseas, but I've lost my native tongue through coming here. But, we could go on forever. We've got many Slido questions coming in, so we might jump to some of those at the moment. Top question is, will we have access to mapped culturally diverse data through the new version of Table Builder? i.e. overseas born across LGAs. I might put this one to you, Duncan.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Virginia. So just for people, if they don't know what Table Builder is, it's one of our, most powerful tools for using census data. It allows you to build any table that you want. So you decide what you want in the rows and what you want in the columns, and you can look at different data, different cross classifications in a way that protects the privacy of the underlying data. So it's really a great tool. And as I mentioned earlier, it's out tomorrow. So that's really exciting for our census users. You can definitely use the new version of Table Builder with 2021 census to look at overseas born by LGA or by any other geography you want, and it'll create that in table form for you. There's not a mapping facility inside the new version of Table Builder, so you then need to just take that data out and use whatever mapping tool you usually use for looking at the data, but certainly all of that data will be available.
Great. And we'll keep your questions coming, but for those watching, just remember slido.com and the hashtag is Census Seminar. Second question here is, what is the definition of culturally and linguistically diverse or multicultural in the Australian context? Does it include people from Western countries? This might be another one for you, Duncan.
Yeah. For the ABS, when we look at the cultural diversity and also linguistic diversity of the Australian community, we think of it more as a rich tapestry rather than a sort of a single kind of line definition. And so when we're talking about our cultural diversity in our data, we talk about people's country of birth and country of births outside Australia. So that it definitely includes European countries as well as Asian nations as well as African. And we also talk about country of birth of parents. We talk about our different languages. We talk about the different religions that people have an affiliation to. So yeah, it's a very broad kind of representation of all of the things that make, I guess, our community unique across lots of different dimensions.
Great. We've got one for the panel now. What is the one fact or insight from the 2021 census which most stood out or surprised you? I might go to you first, Mandy.
Well, I think I touched on it earlier. It's just the increase in the languages spoken. The fact that, 75% of our existing languages, and we broadcast in 60 plus languages, the most multilingual broadcaster in the world, have actually grown even though we had a 2-year pandemic in the middle, which limited migration. So that to me is extraordinary. And the stories that you told about the Nepali community and how that's also played out in the Punjabi, growing by 80%. It's incredibly exciting, but I was really, really surprised. We thought there might have been a lot more sort of shifts up and down across the board.
Mohammed, what surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most, I think, it shouldn't be a surprise, but we are becoming more multicultural, which is fantastic because that's where the value, that's where we can actually tap into the benefits of diversity. But I think what was pleasantly surprising is that when we were doing the analysis around where the vaccination during COVID, we used to use the 2016 census data, and then when the 21 census data came out, they kind of, fast-tracked it for the purpose of tackling the pandemic. We actually saw a lot of those communities actually were on trend. So there wasn't a huge change between the 2016 versus the 21 census, which kind of gave us some assurance that the trends don't lie, and what we've been working on has been effective, and we've been, kind of putting our resources and our efforts towards those communities to keep everyone safe.
And Duncan, you're obviously across these numbers and crunching them all the time. Was there any surprises for you?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about national kind of pictures, but one of the things I really love about the census is it can really tell us some local stories. And one of the ones which stood out to me was a little suburb called Point Cook on the western edge of Melbourne, 65,000 people. We think it's arguably the United Nations of Australia. There's 141 different countries of birth within that suburb alone. So that was one which I was impressed by.
Wow, there you go. Now, we've got a question here from Christina. How can we better capture data on refugees and people seeking asylum to identify the specific experience and needs of this cohort? Mohammed.
I think there's some decent data that's actually being captured. I think what we need to do better is to really actually tell those stories a little bit more. I mean, FEC is a very small organisation, but I think I would love to see some kind of analysis pack of multicultural communities that actually digs deeper into refugee communities, new emerging communities, into more useful data that is actually publicly available. Obviously, the Department of Home Affairs it covers has a lot of that information. So it's not just the census; it's different departments also capturing a lot of those information. And I believe they publish some of those things, but it's just how do we actually get them out into the community and actually tell a story.
And Duncan, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the exciting things we did in 2016 census that we'll repeat this time is work with Home Affairs to get. They've got a settlement database which has information on what visa status people came into the country with, and by bringing that together in sort of an anonymised way with census data, we were able to publish a product which allows you to look at census data by whether or not people came on a humanitarian visa versus a skilled visa versus a partner visa. And I don't have the data to hand, but one of my recollections was that one of the stories afterwards is that people who arrived on humanitarian visas were twice as likely to start their own business than people who arrived under visa types. And so I agree, Mo, there's a huge richness of data there that we should spend some time telling some stories about.
Yeah, the questions are now coming in thick and fast. Remember, the hashtag is Census Seminar, and you can get onto slido.com. This one might be for you, Duncan. How will ABS enable First Nations idea of place, not suburb postcode, be recognised in future censuses?
Yeah, a really, really good question in Virginia, and one that we started a conversation about it in 2021, and we've published information about the consultation process, trying to look at what's the next layer of data that people would like to put forward to expand on their identity in the census as a First Nations person in Australia. Is that about a language group? Is that about a nation, a mob that they're connected with? And so that's something that definitely will be a piece of our consultation process towards 2026, is to try and understand, well, what's the need here and what's the best way to try and explore that. I think it would be a really rich addition to the census, but a really tricky and difficult thing to make sure that we ask in a way that is very inclusive and not exclusive across the country.
Yeah,
we had similar conversations internally with the Census Explorer, and we were trying to map, what we understand about nations and places, and it's still just too complicated. So that's the ambition for next time.
Great. Now, we were speaking about languages a little bit earlier. Is language data cross-referenced with English proficiency? This would form one part that would identify what languages are most in need of translated resources. Who wants to take this one?
I'm happy to. I believe they are, and that's how we actually use the data to figure out, where we need to kind of put our resources into. I think that's the biggest challenge for government and business. How do you actually communicate to hard to reach communities? And I think it's that question of English language proficiency that's used to figure out, where do we need to kind of, focus our efforts in terms of language at an LGA level or, at different levels. Interestingly, the lowest, English proficiency is about 10% behind the general population when it comes to, for example, the vaccination example, I'll use that. So we need to obviously do more to ensure that we build trust with those communities at a very grassroots level. It's a community development exercise for all of us. It's a communication problem, but it is solved through community development, because we need to build the leadership capability of those communities to take up the responsibility, and actually we need to support them to be able to communicate critical information, government information with their communities. Ultimately, it's about trust.
Yeah, and trust is an important thing. We were discussing off camera, Duncan, just sort of, certain questions I guess do get skipped over. Are people sort of a bit worried answering some questions? Is the trust building an issue there?
Yeah, I think it's a critical part of our approach to census, but particularly in at our migrant communities who might have had quite different experiences of census and government in their home nations. And so certainly that's been a real focus for us. Each census is how do we work with organisations like FECA and SBS and specific cultural groups in the community to try and make sure that they understand the value of a census for their community and their participation. And actually, one of the really pleasing things we saw in the census in 2021 is that we measure how much does the census undercount different groups of a population, and the undercount of overseas born is actually much lower now than Australian born across Australia. So for I think every overseas born country that we measure it for, except for New Zealand. So some of that work in trust building must be working.
Yeah.
Can I just follow on from that point? I think the issue of government trust is really important, because a lot of new and emerging communities come from refugee backgrounds, and there is a distrust of government. And that's why it's really, really important, I can't stress this enough, that we work with community organisations on the ground, whether it's refugee resettlement organisations or multicultural organisations, to be the bridge between government and communities until that trust is built. So I think that's really important, and we need to work on that going forward.
Yeah, I think from an SBS perspective, similarly, we really take a big responsibility for being that comms arm, I guess, in all the various languages to try and counter any disinformation or misinformation that can be in social media, to actually explain what is a census, how do you do it, why do you do it? And then to tell the stories, because that's the big thing is, you know, because of the census, this happened or this was invested in and this can help your community. So from our perspective, you know, we start really early in the process in trying to connect all communities with the census so they feel confident and trust to fill it out on the night.
Great.
I think that, sorry, I wasn't supposed to make this point, but I forgot.
I've got another question specifically for you, but
God.
you finish.
I think we need a piece of work here as well, just to make sure that we communicate why this data is actually being collected and make sure that people understand that this is not to spy on people, but to actually design services. So I think I think it's everyone's responsibility to build that trust again, but also actually show people how this census data is actually going to help them and their communities going forward. Because I believe potentially, I mean, anecdotally, some people might not fill it out for fear of, you know, giving their data to government, but also I think it's a bit of an education piece that needs kind of ongoing refinement.
Yeah, because the capture is quite large, isn't it? Was it 96% you were saying earlier?
Yeah, we had a 96% response rate, so that exceeded our targets in 2021, and an undercount. So when we actually measure what part of a population is missing, of only 1% of a population missing from the census data overall. So it's really great, but it's only achieved through some of the things that Mo's been mentioning, those kind of partnerships. We had over about 7,300 field staff employed that spoke a language other than English. So nearly a quarter of our field staff spoke a language other than English. So that's so important when you're getting out there, knocking on doors, talking to people, trying to establish, I really like the phrasing, establish that bridge from what we're trying to do here and what the benefit is.
Amazing. So, Mohammed, this one's specifically for you. You talked about needing an access and equity plan. Can you think of examples of businesses that are harnessing diversity data to make their services more relevant for cold communities, and what can others learn from them in shaping the plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think all businesses should be using the census. I mean, obviously, you know, commercial, benefits are not a driver. Then, but often businesses are the first ones to actually, lead on some of these things. I mean, I'm sure we've been in suburbs that are very culturally diverse, and we've seen some of those big companies. I'm not going to name names, but they advertise they advertise their products in a language that is localised to that community, or they recruit people from that community because they understand that, you know, that trust, or if somebody speaks a language that you're more comfortable with, then you probably do business with that organisation rather than somewhere else. So we need to kind of translate that goodwill and that drive, not just for the profit-making purposes, but also to government agencies and not-for-profit and so on and so forth.
Okay.
I think I can add to that because SBS has advertising, so we do find exactly that. I can think of some retailers who will advertise in languages on radio, and then they understand the suburbs or the areas where their stores are, and then when you walk in as the shopper, they'll have people in store who speak your language. So it's end to end, and just that connection to firstly advertise in language, but then to go in and have somebody who speaks your language or can haggle in your language really, amplifies the experience. And we know that there's been some great success stories around that.
Yeah. Now, Mandy, this one looks like it's for you. Why does the SBS Australian Census Explorer, why is it translated in languages like Greek and Italian, where English proficiency is arguably higher than more recent migrants? Greek is ranked 7 as a language most spoken. However, a majority of Greek speakers are born in Australia, and 96.9% are citizens. I'm going to trust those statistics from the question.
So look, I think this time around we looked at large languages, and some of those that are growing, like Spanish and Korean, etc. And Greek and Italian, yes, they're large, and Duncan touched on Italian earlier, but they are increasingly English proficient. However, I think from our perspective, because there are, what did you say, over 1 million people who are of Italian heritage, it's still a really interesting tool for people who may not speak the language, but to be able to dive in and look at their ancestry, and to be able to see it in language, and then obviously sit with first generation members of their family who might be ageing, and to show them the tool. So for our first go round in languages, we thought let's look at the biggest and then see, we can obviously see in a digital environment who is actually utilising those languages, and that will then help inform next time around as ideally we then increase the number of languages that we offer.
Great. Duncan, this one's for you, a bit of a history question. Does the 1901 census include Aboriginal Australians?
There actually wasn't a 1901 census, so it was 1911 was the first census of a federation. But no, it didn't, unfortunately, include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It wasn't until after the 1967 referendum that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were fully included in the census. So there was there are figures from a 1966 census, but the 1971 census was the one that really made sure that everyone in Australia was collected. And so, yeah, we did acknowledge the 50-year anniversary of that in 2021.
Another one for you then. Does the ABS collect racism data currently, or are you planning to?
That's a very good question. Not in the census, we don't. We do run a broad suite of social surveys, and some of those, I think there might be elements of this in what's called the personal safety survey. So the personal safety survey is about people's experience of feeling safe in the community, and I believe there's elements of that which go to racism and people's experience of racism. But certainly, to client.services@abs.gov.au, reach out to the ABS, and we'd love to help.
Great. How can census data reporting differentiate between ethnicity, language spoken and nationality, country of birth? For example, someone who has migrated to Australia may have been born in England and speak English as a first language, but be of Indian ethnicity.
So that very much goes to the question at the moment of ancestry is the one that picks up things other than where you're born or where your parents are born. And so in the census, as it currently is, people were able to indicate up to 2 different ancestries that they have a connection to. That's limiting for some people. A number of us have more than 2 kind of ancestries, but that data will pick up. And so I talked a bit about that in the presentation. So without an ancestry question, there's 460,000 Australian-born parents that have Italian ancestry that wouldn't be visible in any other way in the census. But as you can hear, like these things are complex and tricky to work out. What is the suite of questions, and how does each of those questions work and complement each other to represent the diversity of Australia?
Yeah. Now, what are some of the challenges, with the census in collecting and publishing multicultural information moving forward, and what are, some of the potential solutions?
The panel looks my way. We've touched a little bit on the challenges around collecting data, and actually, thanks to SBS, they helped us with some of our language translations last time into more languages than we've ever translated before. All of our help and assistance materials. We used the translation interpreter service. They took over 70,000 phone calls last time. We ran a number of webinars, a number of fill in the form sessions where people can get together and fill out the census together. I think for some of the issues previously will be same as the issues going forward around trust, understanding, access, and we do really rely on the community to work together to support that. I guess on the positive side, one of the things we've seen is that the shift to digital, the shift to online sort of first as a strategy seems to be really been embraced by some of our migrant communities. I had to check the numbers twice when I looked at them. For people born in India, 97.1% used the online form compared to 78.9% of the Australian population. 97% of the Chinese born use the online form. So certainly for our newer migrant communities, I think the online form offers some options for them. It's easily available, works on your phone, works at home, but also people can use online kind of language tools easily to sort of translate and aid pieces of a census form. But I'd love to hear your views.
Look, I think it's wonderful to kind of have some of this basic data out there, but I mean, what I'd really love is a little bit of a deep dive into this information. Actually, professional analysts actually come up with some insights, because for someone who's not a data nerd but interested in actually looking at the insights, I wouldn't be able to kind of dig deeper than, even if I had the data, I wouldn't be able to make sense of what this trend is trying to tell me, or what this analysis. So I'd love to have a unit dedicated at the census people to actually consult with multicultural communities and government agencies to figure out what are the areas that we need to look deeper into, and if there is a way for us to actually figure out what experiences of racism, for example, or how fourth generation or third generation Italian Australians feel about racism. So I think there are some interesting things, but for that to happen, we need a national conversation around, okay, we give you the basic data, what else do you want us to look into going further?
So what you're saying is sort of going on what Duncan was saying, 97% might have used the online thing, but does that mean they're more tech savvy, or does that mean maybe pandemic or other things made them use that?
Exactly, and without having that national conversation, we're kind of making a lot of assumptions. And I think, the question around whether it's ethnicity, whether it's ancestry, again, different countries use different labels. For example, US uses white, Black or African American, American Indian and Alaskan Native, and so on and so forth. That's very specific for that context. So is Canada and so is New Zealand. Australia needs to have that conversation again, because a lot of people don't like the term of COLD, or culturally and linguistically diverse Australians. I think that's a little bit outdated, but the question then is, what do we replace it with? And we don't have the answer, but that's where I think we need to have a national conversation around what is actually useful for us to collect. Because sure, you can collect your grandparents, this and that, whatever, but what are we actually going to use this data for? So it needs to be practical, but also it needs to be inclusive at the same time.
Duncan, this one's for you. Does the ABS collect data on what questions are skipped? We talked a little bit earlier about, sort of privacy and trust, and if they tend to be skipped by particular communities, is there any way of analysing that?
Yeah, no, a really good question. The answer is yes and yes. We count everything at the ABS, but available right now on the website, you can look at the census dictionary and look at any of the items on the census, and it'll tell you something called the item non-response rate. And so that's how many people have left that particular question blank. And it's really, really small, all percentages. So there's some people that we know we miss altogether on the census. Obviously, they leave all the questions blank. That's the 4% of non-responders. But then on top of that, it's only for questions, it's 2%, 3% of people will leave any particular question blank. And we've seen that since we've gone to online, that's dropped considerably, because the online form can take you to the right question, stop you making those innocent kind of mistakes. We do see questions like questions of income, or questions of religion, which is an optional question, or the new question about long-term health conditions, all have slightly higher non-response rates. Now, when Table Builder is available, you could create a table that shows a breakdown of question responses for, say, long-term health conditions for Nepalese born, and it'll tell you how many people have left, what proportion of our population have left that question blank. So you can definitely look at that and analyse that. It sounds like a really interesting thing to look at. Yeah,
because was long-term health data one of those higher sort of values, I guess, where people did skip over?
Yeah, so it was one of the 2 new questions we had this census, and so we need to do some more work on it to try and understand why it's still very small numbers, sort of, I think about 5% or less, so 95% have answered it. Why people have left that question blank. It could be because they are concerned and feel it's a bit of a private thing to ask about, but it could also be that they just don't know the answer. A census is filled out on the behalf of a household, and so a person filling it out might not know whether or not their housemate or their parent has been diagnosed with one of these long-term health conditions. So it is one that we'll definitely do more work on before 2026.
Now, how will the 2021 census data done in COVID be reconciled, especially in terms of occupations and incomes compared within the future?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly was a unique time to run a census. We probably, we're a little bit nervous in the build-up to it, and in the end, nearly half the country were in lockdown at some stage during the census collection period. In the end, we think it's probably contributed to a higher response rate we got, and there's more people back in Australia rather than temporarily travelling overseas from previous censuses. So on one hand, it was really great for a census data set. But when we look at the data, you do need to have a look at is this a COVID impact? Will it be an enduring impact, or is this a temporal kind of thing? And so one of the great things about the census in Australia is that we do get a crack at it every 5 years. So you can always look at multiple data points. So working from home, clearly something that's been increasing in Australia for a number of censuses. We haven't released data on that yet. That's coming out in October, but you'd expect to see a significant increase there. And so you'll need to look at those longer time points as well as the current time point in order to try and work out what we think the underlying kind of change here is. And so some data we think is not affected much at all. Your language spoken at home is probably not affected at all by COVID, but there's other data items where you go, well, okay, as we all are, we're looking at society going, well, what is the new normal and where do we land and over the next few years?
I think through this forum you might get an idea of some of the questions coming your way for the next census. This one's quite similar to one we had earlier, but some communities are often buried under the statistics of their countries of origin. The ancestry question and language spoken at home do not quite capture their numbers. What strategies do you have to capture the true numbers of such communities?
It certainly sounds challenging to know exactly what community they're talking about here, but for me, it is when you you do use these data in combination with each other, and so creating tables where you look at country of birth versus ancestry, country of birth versus religion, country of birth versus language spoken at home. You can start seeing in different groups emerge from that at the which really gives you, I guess, a bit of a richer picture, but there's no perfect way, I don't think, to capture every group in every way.
And it is tricky because you only have a certain amount of questions, correct? Each year.
Yep.
I think from an SBS perspective, when we first used the census to inform languages, we had similar feedback from communities. I think everyone said, but ours is underrepresented. But I think, therefore, it was an even playing field, right? Because everybody said there are more speakers than is showing up in the data, and it obviously comes back to the person filling it out. When it comes to high needs, so not just the size of languages, that's why we've used a combination of data, and then we've got weightings against that to make sure that we, need can be recentness of arrival, English proficiency, but it could also be age. As people age and revert to their language of origin, their need for a language service goes up. So, I think to your point, it's that combination that really makes the difference and can give you a really true picture of, we end up within SBS with a bit of an index of languages based on needs, which is that combination of data.
We've got, sounds like someone that wants to build their own Visual Explorer. Does SBS have special access to the data, or can anyone build a Visual Explorer from the census data? If communities have true access to the data, they can develop their own solutions. Mandy, do you want to...
Well, we utilise the ABS data with Duncan's blessing. That's what we use.
Yeah, so we love it when people use our data and present it in different ways and interesting ways and increase its use. So to support that, we make a lot of, products available which you need a bit more technical nous around. Data packs you can download, which have confidentialised data at small area levels that you can feed into tools like SBS Census Explorer, geo packages that you can feed into obviously a geographic kind of mapping kind of package. We also have APIs available, so you can set up online services, and many people do, that actually draws the information live from a census website as it's released. So we work with SBS to get them the data as soon as we can and when it's available. But that data is available for others if yeah, we were going to make more Census Explorers, please let me know.
Well, this is a follow-up, I guess. Will the ABS be releasing any new publications with insights about the data you've talked about today?
We are today, 11:30 today, we're releasing an article about cultural and linguistic diversity in Australia and how that's changed. It'll include a number of things we've talked about today and I've mentioned, but go into a lot more or detail in a range of different areas. So that's, yeah, a really great article. The team have done a fantastic job on that. So to 11:30 ABS website today. But then probably really importantly, and goes to some of the areas that Mo's touched on today, is that on the 12th of October we release the second release of census data, and that's where we get the data out about people's occupation, industries, hours worked, internal migration, movement around Australia. And so when we get that data out, that's also going to add another huge dimension to our multicultural understanding of multicultural diversity in Australia.
Great. This is an interesting question here from Nikki. When people who were born overseas skip that question regarding where they were born, how are they counted? Are they counted towards being born in Australia?
We try and be completely transparent in the way that we use our data. So they're actually listed as having their country of birth as not stated. And so you'll see that in a number of the tables. If you look up census data, is that will be some Australian born, some Chinese born, some Indian born, and then some not stated. And so that's where they'll get grouped into. When we produce representations like a pie graph of a nation, how many were born overseas, how many were born in Australia, how many born second generation in Australia. For those, we exclude them out of a denominator altogether. So we don't add them into one of those categories.
Great. We've got a very long question here from an anonymous person. Was the 2021 census representative for cultural diversity, given that it occurred during the pandemic when we had closed borders, increased outward migration? Languages like Dari saw a decrease in speakers in the 2021 census, but surely that's not an accurate depiction of the situation now.
Yeah, it's a good question. We think overall the census is of very high quality from 2021 and probably one of our highest quality censuses. And so one of the things the ABS does is that we bring together an independent panel who confront the census data and publish a report when the census data comes out with their views of whether or not the data is of high quality, and they've said it is of very high quality. The pandemic did make it challenging in the collection of data, and so we needed to work hard to provide as many options as we can. So we still had fill in the form sessions, which are really important for our cultural community, 340 of those around the country to try and support. But we pivoted and tried to sort of run some webinars and the like. But there is no perfect collection in the census. There is always going to be some errors and some missing and some gaps, and so I don't know the detail of the Dari language group, but yeah, it's possible there are spaces where it hasn't done as good a job. If it is, but it's those groups that will then work with the next census to try and make sure we do a better job.
Mandy, you're nodding in agreement there.
Yeah, well, I think the question also is around, in that moment in time, that would have been, to the best of your knowledge, the number of Dari speakers, but the census is only a moment in time. So since August last year, things continue to change and move, and so there may be more Dari speakers today based on the borders reopening. But that's the beauty of the community and country we live in. It's ever changing. So from an SBS perspective, we then look at, your releases around migration, which happened during the course of the year, and other stats that are always coming from the ABS to continue to build on that picture. And so, yeah, post-pandemic, I think those communities are going to start moving very quickly.
You were saying it was one of the more accurate captures. Is that because, in a sense, we were all virtually in lockdown, in some of the bigger states?
So probably one of the little-known kind of facts is a lot of Australians are temporarily out of Australia at any time in usual kind of conditions, non-COVID conditions. So in 2016, when we ran the census, 600,000 Australians were out of a country on census night, like skiing in New Zealand and travelling to Bali to offer working somewhere. What we saw in 2021 was only 39,000 Australians were temporarily out of the country because of obviously the border conditions of a pandemic. And so that's 560,000 people that are now included in the census, including in their households, included in their families, that we miss in a regular kind of census. So some of that is why we're really excited about the richness of the data. And yeah, I think Mandy's point and reminded me of a really good thing too. One of the things we do with a census is there are now lots of different sources of information we can compare it against. And so we do look at census counted 1 million new arrivals in Australia between 2016 and 2021. How many did Home Affairs think there was? How many did our other survey data think there is? Do these line up? And so that's part of the process. That's how the independent panel as well develops a confidence in the data, is by confronting the census against other sources.
Can I just make a point? I think that question of, what's happened there, I think is really important, because if we pick anomalies, then we need to actually investigate to see what's happened. And I don't think that, for example, you guys will be able to find that. And that's why it's really important to work with community organisations to try and go out there and actually consult and dig deeper to find out the reason for, things like that. That's why it's really important for governments and communities to work hand in glove to try and figure out exactly what's happened. You mentioned, obviously, different government departments, having access to data. For example, Home Affairs collects incredible amount of data around migration and internal movements and whatnot. So the census is not everything. That's where data, what do they call it? Data mapping, or is it data linkage projects? Yeah, data integration. So MADIP, or the Multi-Agency Data Integration Project, is a really powerful tool that takes the census data and matches it to their own data to try and figure out exactly what's happening around their customers or their population, which is something that the general population doesn't have access to, but government departments are working really hard to try and scratch beneath the surface. But having said that, that's still not the complete picture. You always need communities on the ground to help you interpret some of that data. You can make some assumptions, but you can't go ahead and kind of design policy and programs without kind of backing it up and verifying that.
We've got a lot.
Or you shouldn't, at least.
We've got another question specific to you, Mohammed. We have 2 shout-outs now. Some businesses don't use census data to guide their hiring strategy. What does FECA do with the private sector to educate, encourage them to employ more people from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, look, this is where I think, we need leaders right from the top, the CEOs of companies or managing directors, to actually make a commitment to issues, whether it's diversity in general or whether it's cultural diversity within their organisations. And we just need people to sit down and actually think about who their customers are and what is actually useful data for them. And once you map that to the general population, you often will see that there is an underrepresentation of people from culturally diverse backgrounds in terms of employees or customers and so on and so forth. And it's not going to magically resolve itself if you don't have specific strategies to say, we are going to do better on this area, and we're going to recruit people from those communities, because it makes economic sense and commercial sense, because those people can speak English, but also they can speak multiple other languages. And I think that skill needs to be recognised. So, for example, a clear one is aged care. As people age, a lot of those people, obviously with dementia, they revert back to their first language, and they need culturally appropriate care that is in language. Those people can, we need people that speak that language, and we need to remunerate them for that extra skill. So, or whether it's, I don't know, for example, Centrelink frontline services, they can help English-speaking, customers, but also they can, help an older Arabic-speaking person out there as well. So we just need to get smarter and actually explain the benefits of recruiting from diverse communities.
Do you think, does it need to be a deliberate approach almost from the business side of things as well? Like, do you think quota systems and things like that work?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Targets, quotas, it all needs to happen, but it's not going to happen if it's someone. It needs to be someone from very high level, almost like a board strategy or a CEO saying, I want us to be leading this. And there are some really good organisations out there. I know that, for example, Woolworths has a very specific strategy to try and recruit people from refugee backgrounds and give them the kickstart in Australia, give them that first initial experience. So I think we need to talk about those strategies a bit more, and maybe companies like that actually sharing the learnings and their understandings of what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. And then it's also a case of, I mean, it makes good business sense, right, to understand your customers, but internally, increase the diversity and train all the staff in terms of cultural competence. I feel like I'm going into a sales mode here, but SBS does have a cultural competence program, Cultural Connect, and millions of workers across Australia have done this program to just increase their understanding, sensitivities, etc. It goes to good business. Yeah.
Great. Another question here for the panel. Allied Health Services currently don't have access to free interpreter services. How will this data be used to advocate for vital support services like free interpreting for culturally and linguistically diverse community members? Do you think you can answer this one, Mohammed?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what the census is for. I mean, we're becoming more multicultural, and this is where FECA's role comes in. We're here to unashamedly advocate for our communities and making sure that government services are responsive, but they're accessible and there is equity in that access. So we know that during pandemic, health has been a main, a big focus for us at FECA. We have established the Australian Multicultural Health Collaborative to bring anyone who wants to, advance multicultural health to the table. We have had really good support from government to try and look into that issue, and that includes allied health. What are the areas that need that equity piece, and whether it's interpreter service, but also we don't want to kind of just stop at, just use an interpreter. I mean, the thing with using interpreters is that you have to do it twice as hard mentally, but also, in terms of cost-wise. So if I don't speak English, I have to speak to you via an interpreter. And that there is that connection that gets missed, and that human element that gets missed, especially when people are trying to navigate really complex services like, the aged care system. Rather than going through an interpreter, it would be fantastic if, the aged care system had people who spoke a language other than English that, you and I can, have a conversation in Arabic and do that assessment. So we just need to get smarter and, actually really commit to solving this issue rather than just, ticking a box and saying we've translated materials in 73 languages and we've buried them somewhere deep in government department websites. So if we're serious about solving this issue, I think we need to include communities. And this is not just for frontline services. I think we need diversity at the highest level of organisations, including senior management.
Great. Now, I'm conscious, just quickly, we've only got less than 10 minutes, so just for everyone watching, do jump onto Slido and put a like next to any questions you would really like answered, because there is still a lot of them to get through. I'm not sure we'll get through them all. Duncan, just finish up what you were saying.
Sorry, I was just going to add, in this particular example around allied health services, the fact that you can now look at census data from what language is spoken at home, what is the English proficiency, and what long-term health conditions are experienced. The data's sort of all there now to be able to bring it together to help make that case that Mo's talking about. And so, we know that the long-term health conditions are very linked to age, most of them, except for asthma and mental health conditions. And so, looking at the Italian and Greek community, we know that in the older Italian and Greek community there are lower language skills, and there will be a high presence of some of these long-term health conditions. They're very localised communities too, so it's not like you need an even spread of services across the country. So I think there's some great opportunities there.
Can I just quickly pick up on the health question in the census? I think there is a bit of a stigma for a lot of our communities that we need to address. Obviously, a lot of people don't want to kind of say, you know, I have a disability, because there are cultural sensitivities around that. So I think we need to have that conversation with those communities to really better explain to them what this question is really used for and address that stigma. And I think there are not only language barriers, but also there are cultural sensitivities that we need to address and explain in future censuses.
Okay, now we've got less than 5 minutes. This one's probably for Mandy and Duncan. Can ABS, SBS develop platforms, training for smaller cultural groups to make sense of the rich data to inform their decision making? We have over 44 cultural groups living within 3 LGAs of Western Sydney. How do we support them to use this data to self-advocate?
Well, certainly it's an easy tool, and as I said, it's in 9 languages, including English, so depending on the communities being referred to, they may actually be able to search in their language, which would be really helpful. Then they can go in and they can put in their suburb or the LGA, as mentioned here, and play around and understand the size of the community in that area, what their ancestry is, religious beliefs, age, etc. And then from that, they can actually then compare to other LGAs to actually see if they are they're larger, smaller, etc., and then build a story around that, you know, because if they can see that between, say, 2016 and 2021, their community in that area doubled, and they speak, you know, a language other than English with low English proficiency, that gives them a good case to talk to the local council, for example, and suggest they might want English language learning or a program that is in their language of origin or something like that. So it is very easy to use, and you know, encourage people to jump in and have a play. But we'd also welcome feedback as well if there is anything that is missing or a way in which we could serve that data in a more sort of user-friendly way. We'd love to receive that feedback as well.
Duncan, we might come to you with a different question. Can we access census data for free on the ABS website about cultural diversity and religious affiliation for regions such as states and LGAs?
Absolutely. It's all free.
Great. And also, just a follow-up, does census report on emerging languages?
Yes, by looking at what languages are present in one census and looking at what languages were present in a previous census, and by looking at the difference between those, you can certainly see the emerging languages. Our analytical article today does highlight and focus in on languages where there's been in great growth. Mandy mentioned the 80% growth in Punjabi earlier, but also some of the smaller languages which have, like, sometimes their growths are tens of thousands of percent because it's gone from really small numbers to larger numbers. So yes, absolutely, that data's there.
Great. Now, unfortunately, that's where we have to leave it. There is still so many questions and just great discussion here today. So thank you very much, everyone on the panel. And that's all for today. Thank you for your questions, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, Duncan, Mohammed, Mandy. Now, remember, this seminar has been recorded and will soon be available on the ABS website and the ABS YouTube channel. The next release of 2021 census data will be available on the 12th of October and will provide data on employment and location-based information. To access the detailed analytical article Duncan mentioned, go to www.abs.gov.au/articles. Before you get on with the rest of your day, we'd love you to share with some of your insights of our new SBS-produced TV news bulletins in Arabic and Mandarin, broadcast during prime time every weeknight right here on this desk. SBS's use of the census language data has built the case for these locally produced news bulletins to ensure the services we provide meet the needs of our communities, in this case our large and diverse Arabic and Mandarin speaking communities. Please also jump onto the Slido survey to provide your feedback and help us continue to make sure everyone gets the most out of these types of seminars. Thanks very much and have a lovely day. Take care and stay safe wherever you are.
澳大利亚百年一遇的事件。 SBS is now producing impartial TV news in both Arabic and Mandarin, connecting more Australians to the news stories that matter most. It's your news, produced locally.
هذه أخبار الإس بي إس بالعربية.
SBS新闻.
Weeknights from 8 on SBS World Watch and anytime on demand.